Good morning, everyone. I am absolutely delighted to see so many of you here for this fascinating talk by Don Perkins. I'm Carol Fowler. I'm one of the members of the Chats with Champions Committee. And first, I would like to ask you to turn off all your electronic devices, if you would. This series is a free community offering from your national award-winning Skidompha Library. However, free will donations are always needed and welcome. There's a basket for donations on the table to the left as you leave the meeting hall. And also, if we don't have your email, there is a clipboard on that table for you to sign up for what I promise is only a once-a-week email from the library. That's the library's electronic newsletter. The chats succeeding today's will be Thursday, November 12th at 10. Kevin Mannix was the morning weatherman at WCSH 6. And although he's occasionally on air as a fill-in weatherman, Mannix retired from full-time work earlier this year to concentrate on writing Weathering Shame. That's a book he co-authored with his wife about their individual experiences with shame and stigma throughout their childhood and adult lives. But today's champion is Don Perkins, and he has a passion for barns. His book, Barns of Maine, Our History, Our Story, is available for purchase for $20 after he speaks, and he'd be very happy to autograph it for you also. Excuse me. Don Perkins' infatuation with barns began early in his career as a carpenter, during which he built homes as well as perfected his woodworking. He has a long-time interest in timber framing and is a former member of the Timber Framers Guild. Don has said that timber framing with hand-hewn materials is almost a lost art. And as a carpenter early in my working life, he said, hints of old-time joinery just drew me in. I guess I wanted to trace the roots of it. There was something about hand tools, old planes, plumb bobs, chisels, and axes that simply fascinated me. I think barns became a natural study since the frames are exposed. The joinery is there for us to see. History is another large interest, and barns are filled with that too. I'd like to introduce and welcome Don. Please join me.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Carol. It's great to be here, and it's great to see Storm didn't keep too many of you away. This book is the process of probably 4 years of compiling information about barns. It started as a newspaper column. I was a freelancer for the Press Herald and for weeklies around the Sebago Lake area where I live. And when I first broached the idea to my editor of the paper that I'd like to do a series on barns, it was very lackluster response, and I thought he didn't think there was much room for growth there, and maybe kind of boring. But it turned out that I ran for 20 weeks with it, and it was a challenge out of 2 towns that this weekly covered to find a barn a week for 20 weeks. But I did it, and people started writing in letters to the editor saying how they enjoyed it, and I was urged to compile it into something greater. So it came out in 2012, and I've been having a great time with it. I did the whole state, I like to say from Arundel to Aroostook, and I was very fortunate as a writer that this book had not been written yet. And I was quite surprised that this book had not been written yet. That's how common barns are, but a statewide survey really didn't exist. So I'm very fortunate. I start today with this slide, and I call it Our History, Our Stories, for a reason. As Carol was saying, I am a former woodworker and carpenter, and that's how I came to this. I knew it was something I could write about for the papers, etc. But as I started interviewing folks and stopping at these structures, I realized that there was all these human stories that were just fascinating, and I had to include those too. So the book has a mixture of architecture with plenty of human stories, rich stories. I start with this slide for a reason. You'll see there's a date on it, 1880. I love it when a barn has a date on it. 1880, turns out, was the high point or the zenith of farming in Maine, which surprised me. I thought it would maybe be just before the Great Depression. But evidently it didn't get any bigger than 1880, and it gave us our big, grand, mostly dairy barns with Victorian influences. And this one is in Milo, near Brownville, and they have a lot of slate quarries up there. And this is all slate. This hood over the door is slate, cupola is slate. And just love the window, it's almost something you see in a church. So this is probably one of the best examples of the highlight or the heyday of barns in Maine. As we go, please, if you have a question, please stop me, please raise your hand. I found that that's often the best way to handle questions. I will have a question session at the end, but as we're going through the slides, if you have a question on something, please raise your hand and we'll try to address it. Okay, well here's a barn in Bridgeton from the 1830s. And it's obviously a pre-Civil War barn. You notice it has an offset door. You see the windows are symmetrical with the roof peak, but the door is offset to the left. And that's absolutely done on purpose. And that's how you can tell you have a barn usually before the Civil War. The offset is usually always facing the sunny side of the barn, and that's where the cattle would have been stabled, or the animals. And this longer, wider section would be the haymow, or the haymow. This was a day before you really had hay lofts. Hay was kept to the side, usually the north side, the cooler side of the barn. You'll usually find no windows on this side, but you'll find windows on the south side for the benefit of the animals in winter. So it's done very much on purpose, this offset door design. It's called the Temperance Barn. It's owned by the Bridgeton Historical Society today. And I found out that it's named the Temperance Barn because no rum was used during its raising. Supposedly, the beverage on hand at every barn raising in the 1800s was a barrel of rum. But these teetotaling New Englanders chose to skip that, and so it became dubbed the Temperance Barn. Yes?
This is just a technical question. Could we turn the lights down a little bit?
Would you like, Ralph,
Please.
this right here?
Turn down the rear ones.
All of them.
Rear.
You want rear?
Yep. And then, okay. And the front down a bit.
Okay. Oh,
They were being taped today, so.
Okay. So there you go. Good.
Oh, okay. That brings the slide out a little better, huh?
yeah.
Okay. Well, how many folks here have a barn? Oh, excellent. I'd say we have almost half the group. Well, barn people are good people, I always say. And if I've done my job today, I'll turn each of you into a barnologist by the end of the day. Okay. Well, I'm going to read a bit from the book, and I'm going to focus on this barn on the screen. The Temperance Barn, it's 1830s. One of the boys in the family grew up on this farm in the 1840s, 50s. Went off to the Civil War to fight, was taken prisoner, but he survived, returned home to the farm, and he left a marvelous diary of his boyhood on the farm. And I've reproduced some of it here in the book. And this is him quoting here. Although we lived in cold and sterile Maine, we did not lack for many luxuries of life. Edwin described how the attic provided a place for children to play, as they were not allowed to play inside the main barn in those days. Quote, the attic was one vast room where we youngsters were monarchs of all we surveyed. When the weather would not permit us to stay outdoors, we had great times here. The barn was another place free from the constraints of instilled order found within the proper rooms of a family home. If a young boy were to kiss a girl, he had a much better chance of doing so in the barn, especially when the corn was ready. After corn harvesting came husking. It was the custom in those days to fill the barn floor with unhusked corn, and then ask the young people to come and husk it. We all enjoyed these occasions, a regular lark. Many of our neighbors made a gala event of it, asking all the girls to be there and help get the husking out of the way early so dancing could begin. There was a rule that whoever found a red ear was entitled to a kiss. There was some rivalry among boys when they selected partners. Some of the girls would hide their red ears if their partner was not to their liking. Well, I also wrote a barn column for a paper called the Advertiser Democrat in Norway, South Paris area. And I defined my own subjects for that. And that was sometimes a challenge. And I reprinted one barn column from these newspaper series for the book. And it was this place here. And because I had a very interesting, totally impromptu meeting with the owner of this property. And I'll just read this article. It's called Talking with the Barn Generation, Oxford. Oxford. Last Saturday was an interesting day. With the prospects of one barn I planned to feature for this series falling through, I was in dire need of a plan B. Thus I headed north up Route 26, searching for another barn to explore with no idea where I might end up or who I might meet. I soon spied a handsome-looking small white barn at the corner of Route 26 and Station Road. Ah, an English barn, I thought. That's interesting. I haven't written about too many of these. It was built on a slope, and I spied what looked like an old manure basement. Although it appeared this barn had been finished off inside and perhaps had other uses now, I still thought it was a nice prospect. I parked the car and proceeded towards the front door. "Come on in, the friendly old gentleman said almost immediately as he fumbled with the doorknob and gestured me inside. I was amazed how welcoming Bob Bartlett was. Most of the time, when I encountered with a stranger, folks will hang in the doorway and give me a good look over, at which point I typically present my card and explain I'm interested in their barn. Mr. Bartlett didn't really seem to care why I'd come. He didn't. He promptly offered me a seat in his living room and we began to chat. I write a series about barns for the Advertiser Democrat in Norway, I explained, handing him my card. Barns, he said, as he gave both me and the card a closer examination. I noticed you have a small English barn here, I said. Can I take a look? What, that thing, he said with indifference? That's not old, at least not what I would call old. It's sawn timber, maybe 1900. I'll show it to you in a minute. With that, I began thinking I should move on, that my earlier suspicions were right. This really wasn't an old barn at all. However, Bob Bartlett showed no signs of letting me off that easy. As he sat in his easy chair, he packed his pipe and struck a match to a fresh quantity of Captain Black. His dog rested comfortably on the couch. How long have you lived here, I asked, trying to feel things out. Oh, about 20 years, he said, getting his pipe burning. I grew up in Montville, near Belfast. I used to be the town manager for Norway. I spied some woodworking magazines on his coffee table and noticed a beautiful old bookcase with glass doors along the far wall. It was tall, probably 7 feet high, with nice ornamentation at the top. As a former woodworker, I thought this was a potential point of commonality that might break the ice for us. I illuminated my woodworking background and asked what kind of wood the case was and if I could take a closer look. Sure, he said, help yourself. It was when I looked inside that I saw the old books. My interests were instantly piqued at seeing such titles as Keeping Livestock Healthy, 1942, The Principles of Dairying, Animal Sanitation and Disease Control, and there were others. I just knew there had to be some solid information on barn history within these pages, like how disease factors changed elements in our barns, getting a date range on some of these modifications, and the subsequent regulations were notoriously difficult, areas of great interest to researchers like me. Quote, I used to be a tester for the Waldo County Dairy Herd Improvement Association, Bob explained, as I asked about the books. I used to test milk for butterfat. I tried probing him again on the barn and whether or not I could take a look. We'll go in a minute, he said. I don't move too fast. I sat back down and we started talking barns. I told him where I lived. He asked if I was or had ever been a farmer. I said no. He then asked me about rooftop cupolas and whether I knew what they were used for. He was testing me, probing someone half his age, on an area of interest usually known by older, more seasoned folks. They're for ventilating the buildings, I answered. They started appearing around 1850 or 60 and got pretty fancy around the Victorian age. Bob nodded in agreement. I explained how keeping manure in a manure basement became all the rage among farmers in the early to mid-19th century, and that air quality in these barns eventually became problematic, especially in the winter, when animals spend little, if any, time outdoors. The moisture from the manure combined with the breath from the animals would rise and condense on the underside of the cold roof, I explained. This also made the hay unpalatable to the animals. But cupolas served a purpose in summer too, I said, because you wanted to keep your hay cool. Bob concurred and broke in. Putting in green hay would give you problems, he said, referring to the composting action of moist hay. As any seasoned farmer knows, these conditions created immense heat within a mound of loose hay and could start a fire through spontaneous combustion. Indeed, many barns burned this way. Wanting to gain additional credence with Bob, I remarked how a farmer I knew said a common practice was to put salt down between questionably dry layers of hay as it drawed the moisture out. Yes, Bob agreed with a nod. The animals probably liked the taste as well. We were beginning to hit it off nicely, and I sensed he enjoyed talking with someone about farming in barns. Soon enough, we ventured through the kitchen to the barn I'd been inquiring about. It was quickly apparent that this building had never had any animals housed within. Instead, the previous owners had made a fine-looking 24 by 34-foot garage with all the elements of a barn. A paved ramp that led up to a nice sliding door with old granite, block, and stone mortared in nicely, giving it the appearance of an old barn foundation. And its multi-levels, roof pitch, and proportions gave it the hallmarks of a small barn. But this is just Bob's garage and woodworking shop. Details of its construction, including rough-cut dimensional lumber fixed with modern hardware like joist hangers, suggest this building is probably 50 years at best. It was getting cold, so we came back in and sat some more. I was eager to hear about Bob's days as a dairy tester and his memories of barns, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. One question I posed in particular stood out. Ever seen a barn burn, I asked. 1941, I saw a barn burn, yes, he said. Father woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, said the barn's on fire. I got up and looked out the window. The barn was all ablaze, 86 feet long. We don't know what started it. October 20th, 1941. Bob was about 10 years old then, and because the home was connected to the barn, everything burned flat. Their livestock was lost. Bad wiring was ruled out. Even though the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 provided low-cost loans to many, the Bartletts didn't have power because they simply couldn't afford it. After the fire, Bob said his father decided it was cheaper to relocate the family than to rebuild. As we talked, we concurred that farms and barns are disappearing. Knowledge about barns is fleeting too. Bob said it's too bad, but many young people have romantic visions of farming. Quote, they don't realize how much work is involved, he said. You can't take a vacation. I was fortunate to happen upon Bob Bartlett and engage him in conversation, and he was kind enough to lend me some of his old books. Perhaps the information contained within will grace these pages in the coming weeks and months. A big thank you goes out to Mr. Bartlett, who is part of a generation that's a veritable storehouse of the common barn life and its fading memories. Well, I had to make an addendum when the book came out a year later. Sadly, Bob Bartlett left us before this book went to print. He passed just before Christmas, December 23rd, 2011. And that happened, I guess I did this book none too soon. That happened through the writing of the book. People I wanted to interview or barns I wanted to visit, people either passed on or the barns fell down. So, yes?
You mentioned that this is an English-style barn. My barn on my alpaca farm in Waldoboro is almost exactly the same size. It has been, it's about 1840. It's been described to me as an English-style barn because the door is not in the gabled end, but in the side of the barn.
Yes, that's right.
And the loft is a U shape going into that, so that the carriage would have gone in, the two-horse carriage would have
Yeah.
gone into there, and then there would have been a U-shaped loft. Is that the only thing that makes it an English-style barn, is where the doors are?
Yes,
That's the only thing?
that's really the only determinant. And we're going to I'll explain why why that layout was like it was in a few minutes here. Okay, well, let's get into the meat of the lecture. You can learn a lot about something by researching the word and the origin. Barn is a Middle English term from the 12th century, and it actually is a combination of the old spellings for barley and place, and essentially means barley store or barley house. And it's why barn and barley have a common spelling, which is interesting. What I take from this is it has nothing to do with livestock at all. This is a building based on grain. Barns are built with heavy timbers, and they're fashioned into what are called bents. A bent is a noun when we're talking about barn building. There are 3 bents here, and these can be built in various ways. They're built with mortise and tenons. You've probably heard that term. The tenon is the tongue, and the mortise is the hole. What surprised me on this, though, is just how old this is. This is obviously much older than Maine, much older than European colonization. Discovered that the pyramids, 5,000 years ago, when they built those, they hauled stone on wooden sleds. And some of these sleds have been found in excavations and have been put together with this mortise and tenon method. So it's at least as old as the pyramids. Here we go with the English. As I poked around as a barnologist with an eye for barns, I noticed there's really 3 generations of traditional wooden barn in Maine, 3 types. And the first, this being New England, the first is what they brought from the Old World, from England, and we call it the English barn. And as we said, what determines an English barn is it has the door under the eave walls and not the gable end. And there typically would have been another set of doors on the back side, because the farmer wanted the wind to blow through the shortest dimension of the building for the hand threshing of grain. When the farmer harvested his grain, oats, barley, wheat, etc., he put it on the threshing floor and beat it with a flail. Okay? A flail is 2 rods joined by a piece of leather or cord. And you would beat the grain on the threshing floor to get it roughly processed, get it broken from its stalk, get the outer casing cracked, etc. And after he's done with that, he'd sweep it up and put it in this, maybe a disc-shaped basket, or perhaps 2 people would cradle it in a blanket. And on a windy day, they'd throw all the doors open, and if everything worked as planned, they'd toss this mixture to the wind to separate the wheat from the chaff. You can see the lighter chaff blowing out, and the wheat was allowed to fall, heavier was allowed to fall. And what stopped everything from blowing out of the barn was a little board at the bottom called the threshold. That's where we get the term threshold. Okay? You'll see these are very basic buildings. There's no basement. They're right on the ground. They're usually pretty small in size. And they're not even sided, or at least the early ones weren't. That's why old barns have vertical boarding, because they shed water much better this way. And you wouldn't have sided your barn in the early days anyway. You wouldn't have gone to the expense of getting nails. You would have sided your house, but you would not have sided your outbuildings. So they were drafty. They hardly had any windows. You'll see there's no ornamentation. There's no fancy roof trimmings. Very basic building. Well, after a few generations, we decided it wasn't working so well for us, and we got more and more interested in livestock farming over here. In England, they could keep the livestock outside a lot longer, a lot more often, but in Maine, with the more severe winters, and livestock was much more a part of our farming plan here. And we needed a barn that was bigger and better suited to livestock, and this is the design we came up with. And this is what most people recognize when they think barn. You see we brought the main entrance down to the gable end, and we have a long aisle aligned with the roof ridge. And this is much better for expansion than the other design was. If you want a longer barn of this type, you just add on the end, and you get a longer configuration of the original design. You can service the whole area with a horse and wagon through that center aisle. There we go. If you try to expand this older design, it's problematic. If you go on either side, you're getting further and further away from your main aisle, and you can't really go on the back because you have the sloping roof that will come down. These designs proved inefficient. In fact, if you go poking around, you will find barns that look like this are actually two English barns drawn together end to end with new roof and siding and new entrance doors on the ends of those. The third and final generation is what we call the GAMBREL. And that's, this style roof is a GAMBREL. It's got two pitches. And this came about to reflect, this is now commercial scale farming. Okay? We're no longer the family farm eking out for ourselves. We're doing a certain crop or a certain kind of livestock, and we're doing it in a big way. And hay handling had changed at this point. You can always date a GAMBREL barn in Maine. They're always 1900 or later. At this time, hay handling had changed to the point where it was still loose hay. Baled hay didn't come until about the 1940s. But the hay forks that you'll see in the roof ridges of barns were patented in the late 1800s. And this design, where you had a wide section here, you could pick up a huge mound of hay and roll it back with this GAMBREL design. Whereas the gable design before that was squat and low, and it didn't allow rolling back of hay as well as this did. Okay, so barns are a study, just like anything else. A lot of things drove barn design, from grain to livestock, our climate, expansion, like I said. Hay and manure handling was always changing. And in the early part of the 20th century, disease certainly had an influence in how we built barns. We'll get into that. Well, you can't talk about barns without talking about farming. Here's an early snapshot of farming. This surprised me, but it really makes a lot of sense. Original settlers did not come here to farm, right? This is not the breadbasket of America. We have a short growing season. We have rocky soil. Farmers have been challenged here ever since the beginning. They came to lumber and fish, and that's why our communities mostly were along the coast and along rivers that join the coast. You can think of an early barn as protection, not just from the elements, but from predators. Early barn, very simple. You don't find barns before this typically, outside of Portland or Falmouth or areas that were really well defended because of the French and Indian War, where everything was burned. And old barns are low and squat, and that reflects oxen. And this was mirrored in the woods. Oxen were the draft animal of choice. And you can see this with Paul Bunyan. He had bathed the blue ox. He did not log with a horse. Yes?
When did silos come into use?
Oh, excellent question. Silos were 1870 and later. And they were originally inside the barn. And a lot of them didn't work very well. They weren't built strong enough to hold tons of feed. That's why the round silo became, the hoop design was much stronger. Horses were thought to be too weak, so oxen were the preferred animal. But once the speediness of horses was realized, they quickly transitioned. Okay, well, as I traveled the state for the book, I noticed the three styles of barns: the English, the New England, and the GAMBREL. And I noticed there's certain parts of the state that are really more partial to one design or the next. Anybody from Washington County? Nobody ever raises their hand when I say that. Well, I went up to Washington County and looked around, and immediately, this is the barn that you find in Washington County, this small English barn. Well, as a barnologist, I asked myself, why? Okay. Well, I discovered there was a very strong English lineage in that part of the state, and they're isolated. Plus, it's not a big farming country up there. They do a lot of lumber, shipbuilding, blueberries, wreath making, etc. But they don't have real big farms. They don't have a lot of them. And come to find out through research that I don't know if you realize, but the Maine accent comes from England. Most people from Maine came from Massachusetts, and the Maine accent and the Massachusetts, the Boston accent are very similar. They don't say they're ours. This came from England. And where do you think of the iconic Maine accent? Think of Washington County, down east. So it makes perfect sense that they would have stuck with their original plan, the old world barn design, longer than the rest of the state. These are the characteristics of barns in that area. Small buildings, very subsistence-geared farms. They do have a lot of hand-hewn frames, even late into time. And this is interesting to contrast with our neck of the woods. It speaks to the isolation and the economy, I think, of the farmers there. The buildings are very plain with no ornamentation. They love cedar shingles, whereas down here it was typically clapboards. You'll find few manure basements up there, few cupolas. They like the buildings detached from the house. Their small barns are built with H-vents. I'll explain that in a couple of slides. But their larger barns do reflect their English lineage because they are built with English tying joints. Has anybody ever heard of an English tying joint? Okay, a couple. Well, this is an English tying joint. It's the top of the roof, top of the wall post, where the roof comes down, the plate, the tie beam, everything is joined here, and it ties the building together in a very effective manner. I was amazed at how old this is, and this is absolutely English. This is not French, this is not German, etc. At the heart of it is what's called a jowled post. The post starts out square at the bottom, probably 8 by 8. But as it comes up, it flares in one direction to provide more surface area for all this joinery. And it's probably about 8 by 12 at the top. And the carpenters of old were really, ingenious, absolutely ingenious people. They took advantage of the natural taper of a tree. The wider butt end of the tree would be inverted to be the top of the post. Just saved them some of their hewing. So, I had in the last slide that this started in the 13th century England, 1200s. And this barn, just trying to go back just a second here. There we go. Yeah. It's from at least, this is medieval carpentry. Absolutely. And just waiting for my machine here. This is the inside of the temperance barn in Bridgeton from 1830s. So you're talking 1200s to 1800s, with basically an unbroken standard of building. In fact, in England they call this regular assembly. To have that last for 500 or 600 years is remarkable. It just goes to show how well it worked. And to equate it with our time, can you imagine a practice we do today that would be the same in 500 years? In my mind, any barn today with an English tying joint is absolutely historic and should qualify for some kind of status. It should be maybe on the National Register. Because in 2015, if you can go and see this and say that is a direct tie to the old world of the settlers who came here. This is not French, this is not English, this is not German. This is absolutely English. And to go and readily observe this in 2015 should be a qualifier for some kind of, that in itself should be a qualifier for preservation. Okay, well, we talked a little bit about bents. These are the three most common configurations in Maine. This is the English time joint we just saw with the flared gel post. Mentioned H bents a couple of slides ago. And if you could imagine the other wall of the barn, there would be a post that would make the letter H. They call it the H bent. And this here is a connected girt or dropped girt framing. You'll notice there's a continuous plate with this style, there's a continuous plate with this style, but here it's segmented and it's dropped. This came about, this is an absolutely strictly American design, whereas these other two are more European. This came about for when we started building really, really long 100-foot barns. And it was often difficult to find continuous plate material that long. So they came up with this modular approach. And you'll see this is a square post right from the sawmill, whereas you had to hand hew something like this. Okay, well, moving along with farming, 1800 up to about the Civil War. 1800, it was predominantly beef and sheep. They called it beef and wool. We were still a long ways from dairy, really. 1820, we had 31,000 barns. 1825, the Erie Canal opened. And you might be saying, well, what does the Erie Canal have to do with barns? Well, actually, it had a lot to do with farming. It was the first taste of competition that the Maine farmer felt from the Adirondacks, Ohio, places with better soil, longer growing season. And the goods could be brought over here, often cheaper or better than we could do. And this only increased after the Civil War with the railroads. The first dairy cattle came 1850. 1850 again, interestingly, an apple orchard is considered the best source of income for a farmer. And just before the Civil War, we had almost doubled the barns from stagecoach, so we were very much growing during this period. Here we are after the Civil War. Like I had said, the competition started with the Erie Canal. By the time the railroads linked up the breadbasket, Maine was like, forget it, we're not going to grow wheat. So we had to come up with something. We had to come up with a strategy on what we were going to do to save farming. And we did that largely with dairy. It was a perishable product that we could produce locally. We had a lot of cleared land, a lot of good grazing land. Dairy, there's an argument that can be made that dairy saved farming in Maine. Yes?
The previous slide said the Jersey cattle were the originally introduced.
Yes. Yep.
A reason
There we go.
for Jersey rather than Guernsey? Or,
I don't know the answer to that.
I know that it's a rich and fat milk. But
That's a good question. Holsteins ended up winning the day, really, at least in the 20th century.
you don't get as much butter from a Holstein's milk.
Interesting. Are you a farmer?
Well, I
Farmer?
grew up on a farm.
Okay. I don't know why it was New Jersey. So anyway, we decided that dairy was really going to be the thing. And you can see this, 1870, beef is largely going by the wayside. The Maine Dairymen's Association begins. And then we get, like on the first slide I had, 1880, showing that big grand barn as the high point of farming. And we took dairy in a big way. And we were shipping milk to Boston. 1888 is now our leading farm industry. And just about every barn I've been in, you can see some evidence of dairy. It was just so common. Okay, we talked about Washington County. Now I'm going to ask anybody from Aroostook. No hands, again. Well, I married someone from Aroostook, and I'd never been up there before. And it's great, you know, I go up there and look around the countryside, and I notice that this is the barn that they have. These big, tall gambrels. So I asked myself, why is that? Well, it's really a latecomer, okay? Our southernmost county, York County, was settled in the 1630s. Aroostook wasn't incorporated until the 1830s. So there's quite a lag up there. And they do farming, obviously, now on a big commercial scale. They do potatoes. These barns were geared for horses and hay. Horses and loose hay. And this is what you'll find in Aroostook County. Big barns. Most of them are after 1900. Large-scale commercial use. And being French-Canadian, okay, you don't find any English time joints. That's really no surprise. And you don't find a Maine accent up there either. You do find a hybrid of studs and heavy timbers, and that really reflects this time period, just because carpentry was changing. But like Washington County, their hand-hewing really did last much longer. And again, it speaks to their isolation and the economy of the folks up there. They like their barns separate from the house. They do not do the manure basement. Originally built for horses and hay, but soon, after World War II, soon transformed to house tractors and machinery. So here's a barn in Aroostook. This is in Sear Plantation, which is just south of Van Buren. And it's from the 1930s, 1935. And what I take is, it still has its original wood shingle roof, which is really amazing. It's no longer being used for farming. But you'll notice this ladder on the roof. This is a metal ladder permanently affixed. And I always pose this to people I speak to, and I'm going to ask you folks. Do you know what that ladder was for? Anybody have a...
Fire tower?
Fire tower? You're on the right track. Going down the wrong path, but you're kind of in the right area. I thought, as a carpenter, oh, that's how they replaced the bad shingle. You know, they went up to the peak, maybe attached a rope or something. But I thought, I don't know about that. And somebody said, oh, they shoveled the snow with that. And really, if you're up there in Aroostook, which is a lot of wide open field area, there's not a lot of snow that hangs on the top of these. The wind just whips it. What it is, though, is it's for fire. And I was unaware of that until a guy at one of my talks, who was from Aroostook, pointed this out. He said, you'll notice there's no lightning rods in that building. I said, yeah, you're right. And he said, it's probably rotted away, but he said there would have been a platform and a rain barrel up there. And possibly a couple of more as you went down the roof. And you know, the farmer's worst fear, lightning strike hitting those wood shingles. He could run up there in theory and soak the roof. So, I don't see that a lot.
How come no lightning rods?
How come no lightning rods?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's, again, run into a lot of unexplored or unknown stuff with this. I don't know if it was an issue of expense or... Sometimes I'll go looking at a barn and it will have a lightning rod system. And where the cord, where the wire comes down, there'll be this plaque. And it'll say, this is a genuine Acme lightning rod system. Beware of imposters who try to install anything. You know, it's just like 1910 kind of. Very interesting. Well, here's the inside of that barn. And remember, this is 1935, okay? But everything in here is hand-hewn. It's amazing. That you would never find this in this part of the state. By 1935, everything was built with sawmill timber, but not in Aroostook. Even these braces are hand-hewn. These rafters are just peeled poles. And you'll notice how narrow the boarding is. They don't have a lot of big pines up in Aroostook. They have more spruce and fir and narrow trees. Here's another barn in Aroostook, and this has more of an English layout, actually. This one is a little bit older. It's from about 1890. Here's the inside of that. And you'll see very crude. Everything is hewn. You see the narrow boards. And you can see they were purposely spaced, and you can see the original wood shingled roof through the boards. The boards were perfectly spaced so to help dry the roof, so that it would prolong the life of the shingles. Okay, well, how about the rest of Maine, right? We talked about Washington and Aroostook, these isolated kind of outliers. Well, this is the barn that probably a lot of us know. We like to build them on slopes. We like them attached to the house. Well, why is that? Well, I argue we have a wide range of time and transformation in the central and southern part of the state. And outside influences were just much more readily adopted. There were farm journals that talked about barn construction and layout. And a lot of it originated in the southern New England came up. These barns are at Shaker Village in New Gloucester. The front barn is called the stable, was for the horses. And the rear is called the ox barn, where they kept the oxen. And the framing of the ox barn is unbelievable. It's 12 by 12 posts holding up the first floor for those oxen. Much sturdier built than the horse barn. Well, barns in our area, what I call the rest of Maine, this is what we find. Wide range of sizes. They're most all geared towards dairy. Most all are gable entry. We like them attached to the house. We like the manure basement phenomenon. We have cupolas and Victorian trimmings. A wide range of bed configurations. But our hand hewing really did stop about the Civil War. By then the railroads could transport sawmilled stuff pretty well, and the affordability was coming down. Well, the 1800s were absolutely the heyday of barns in Maine. And they went through quite a transformation in that 100 years. This is a barn, early barn from that period, representative of that period. And you see it's not sided, it's drafty. The animals probably suffered. But you can go 50 years later, maybe to the mid-late 1800s, and you have marvels of engineering like this appearing on the scene. This is called a high drive bank barn. This is called a high drive. And, you know, they're using things like ramp and gravity to their advantage for these everyday farming chores. The hay, and it's still loose hay at this point, the hay would be brought up here near the top. The animals would be down here, so that you just pitch the hay down. The animals would process it, and the manure would go, this is on a slope, there would be a manure basement. The manure would be stored down here, so there's a very cyclical kind of thing going. And you'll see it's sided. It has a couple of cupolas. Just much more refined building. Well, this quote from 1907 from the Maine Dairymen's Association really speaks to exactly this thing, and I'll just read it. I am here this evening to say a word of welcome to you who represent the happy homes of Maine. You are also representatives of the great dairy interests of the state. Dairying is today simply in its infancy. I remember when a boy, and some of you older ones can easily remember, the old barn with its great cracks, the scrub cow, the old milking stool. But a wonderful change has come as the years have passed by. Today we find the blooded cow. Today we find a better barn, a better house. We find the barn shingled or clapboarded and painted, and a neatly kept lawn around the buildings. Everything has been progressing and advancing with great strides since you and I were boys. And I believe the future will see as great advancements.
What's a blooded cow?
Oh, thank you, I was glad somebody asked that. Well, the blooded cow is, we were talking earlier about the Jersey was introduced, specifically bred for milk production. Whereas before that, you just had kind of the old farm cow, and you got from it what you got from it. You know, you maybe had 2 or 3 of them. Well, we hinted on disease earlier in the discussion. Tuberculosis was huge. Okay, there were probably folks here who had relatives who died of TB. There were TB sanatoriums. TB hit the state in the late 1800s at the University of Maine, and they didn't know what else to do but slaughter the cows. And we lost a lot of barns this way. You know, farmers would meet at fairs or livestock auctions, etc. And you know, they'd look around, they'd get to talking, and they'd say, you know, Farmer Johnson's cows don't look very good. And now my cows are starting to get sick. I think his cows should be slaughtered and his barn burned. And that happened. You read about that. But this brought about pasteurization with milk, right? And Portland was early to adopt this. They had their hands full in 1921 trying to, you know, revamp this system. But they got a handle on it in about 15, 16 years. But what happened was dairy became the thing, so we started just shoving as many animals as we could into these barns. And we ended up with problems. How did TB affect barns? 1900, 1940. Well, cow manure was found to be a host for TB, and it was passed into the milk. So the manure basements, which were supposedly such a great thing 60 years ago, weren't such a great thing anymore. And if you notice, anybody who's in dairy now, their manure is in a big pit way away from the barn. Wooden floors were just a pathogen. Cement floors you could hose down, but wood floors were just a sponge for bacteria, so those started to be phased out. And this started to put the small mom and pops at a very distinct disadvantage. Lighting, you know, with electricity came in. The interiors started to become whitewashed. And that is not white paint, that is a lime coating, which is a natural antiseptic. And the cupola started going away in favor of the metal roof fence to combat manure dust. And you'll see this period was really when everybody was learning about germs, right? So the attached barn started to lose some of its favor because people were like, oh, I'm sharing the same air with my animals. It's wafting into the kitchen now. So it started to be phased out. Here's a thing. Yes, sir.
What was the original reason for the attached barns, and how did that endanger the inhabitants of the
Yeah.
house?
But you may have heard of the book Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. Tom Hubka has written extensively about this. And you know, the common kind of wisdom, I think, is, oh, so you didn't have to go outside during the winter, right? But you see areas of the country like upper New York State, Minnesota, they have harsher winters than we do, but they don't do the attached barn. And Aroostook doesn't do the attached barn, they have harsher winters. And he argues it was an economic response to the competition that we were facing from the Midwest and from better growing states, etc. That, you know, we did dairy, but there were also a wide number of people who said, we're going to start doing a lot of little home industries, like blacksmithing, candle making, dried apples, whatever. And we're going to keep this all under one roof. It's just a much more efficient way to do things. Sir?
I heard one impetus for moving away from connected barns was insurance.
Yes.
The insurers were not crazy about having a barn burned down that took down everything else too.
Absolutely. Fire, building codes, absolutely. So it wasn't for the snow. Some people say too, though, that barns started getting plumbing and they wanted to keep the pipes from freezing, so they would run the plumbing from the house through the L, etc. And if the barn had animals, it would keep it above temperature. Yes?
I can attest to that. We bought a huge barn, with the stone walls this thick, bank barn, and they had a lot of cows for years and years, and so we purchased the barn, moved some sheep in there, and, the pipes froze. The cows did not. We had the expansion tank and pumped the whole thing. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. But, the connected farmstead is really only found in a fairly small geographic area, really. It's southwestern Maine, a little bit of New Hampshire. And it had its heyday just after the Civil War. But here's a barn in Bethel. This is a family that went through some of these disease regulations, the dairy farm. This is the old barn, 1850s. You'll see it's got a hayloft, it's built on a slope for the manure basement. And this modern tie-up was put in the 1960s. And you'll see almost nothing of an original barn carries over. There's no big hayloft. It's built right on the ground, on cement. After this was built, they just kept hay in the tractors in the big space. This barn's in my book, and I asked the guy, I said, how come it's different shades of red? He was a funny guy. He said, every year, Father would go to town and buy 5 gallons of barn red. They kept changing the formula. So I'm just about finished up, but there's some good quotes here that tie a lot of this together, what we're talking about. Here's a nice connected farmstead. This is in Leamington. Farm journals. The Maine Farmer was one of them, 1857. Overlooked. The building on the farm, which requires the most study and real good judgment to plan and to construct, is the one least thought of in this respect. Is the barn. There's a lot of truth to that. They really, once dairy came on the scene, they really kind of experimented with what was going to work well. Some things worked well, some things didn't. 1868, talking about stud framing, which was coming in. Necessity has done much for the building public by introducing to their favorable notice the balloon style, 2x stud, of building wooden buildings, a style which is not well understood in the old settled and well-timbered portions of our country, like Maine. We held on to our big, heavy timber framing a lot longer than places like Illinois, Ohio. And people have probably heard of this term, right? Balloon framing, balloon style. Does anybody know where that came from? Yes.
It'll blow away like a balloon.
There you go. Excellent. I'm impressed. First person I've ever had in the audience to do that. It was a slam from the old guard of apprenticed carpenters who would see these light, spindly, balloon framing means the stud goes from the foundation 2 stories up to the roof, maybe a 16, 20-foot stud. And they would stand these spindly stud walls up, and the old carpenters would look at that and they'd say, oh my God, that's so light and airy, it's like a balloon, it'll blow away. So it was a slam by the old guard, but it stuck. And there's things that helped this technology. And one of them was the Great Chicago Fire. You can think of it like a Gulf hurricane, When that city burned, they wanted the city up and running quickly, and they didn't want to hire an army of apprenticed carpenters with their chisels and to take forever doing their mortises. So they brought carloads of studs, nails, and hammers.
There's good documentation that the 2x4 also was accepted widely because of the railroads. Because the railroads, as they went west, were building a town a day. And the old hand-hewn kind of stuff didn't ship well, whereas they could fill a boxcar totally solid with 2x4s. And
A keg of nails. And,
yeah.
Yep. Is it better to have a tight barn or a barn that breathes? Well, this was debated in farm journals. Here's an argument for a tight barn, 1841. It is very great and beneficial improvement in building barns to have them shingled down the sides as well as the roof. The extra expense is not so much as many people are ready to imagine, as there is considerable savings to be made in the quality of boards and nails where shingling is practiced. Besides, it keeps the barn warm and the frame dry. Therefore, I think there is no loss and considerable gain at the end by shingling the sides. Okay? Logical. Well, 10 years later, they're talking about the importance of venting. The breath from cattle, together with the vaporizers, not only the floor over the cellar, but the beams and the whole underside of the roof, with pearly trickling drops for weeks together during the winter. If the doors are thrown open in order to evaporate this moisture, you lose the benefits you have been seeking in making a tight barn, by reducing the temperature so much that cattle require more food, while the effect is to reduce the flow of milk in the cows. Many large and valuable barns have been very much damaged by being placed over a manure cellar without proper ventilation. So if you're going to tighten it up, ventilate it. And these were absolutely functional pieces. A lot of folks think they may be just ornamental. They were not. It would have been neat, I think, to see at this time, or maybe a little later, 1900, to see one of these barns on a cold morning just packed with animals. The steam must have been coming out of that cupola almost like a chimney. Just to turn to the last century, there was never a time in our state when there was so much inquiry upon and interest in the proper arrangement and constructions of barns as is now abroad among our farmers. It is realized that there is money in a good barn, and that no one who proposes to put business methods into his management can afford to neglect this important attachment to his farm. Hence, up and down the state, farmers are modifying and building over their ill-planned structures, or tearing them down to make room for the new and modern. And of course, as historians, we lament this, right? These beautiful English tying joints in these barns maybe didn't serve the farmer well, and they started, and this was just the story, right? Modernization, commercialization, and we lost a lot of barns to this. After World War II, a lot of farmers didn't like their old barns because they couldn't drive their tractors in them. There would be low beams or too many posts. So they either started cutting things away, which was not a good idea, or they put lean-tos on the side of their old barns to put their equipment. Okay, well that just about rounds me out. I would be happy to take some questions. And after that, I will have books over here for $20 if anybody would like one. Sir?
Have you been in the Darrow's barn at the DRA here in Damascotta?
I have not.
Oh, because it's got a structure that's different than anything you've mentioned, and I don't know whether it was built to be a real barn or something else.
Huh. What's it called?
It's the Darrow's barn at the DRA. I'll show you on the map or somehow. It's just up the road about 2 miles or less.
Okay.
Can you explain again the reason for the offset door?
Oh yeah, the offset door. Well, sure. Let me try to get to that slide. The offset door was very much purposely done. And it was before the Civil War, typically. There we go. Okay. The offset door, this is offset to the left. Animals or livestock are only so long. Okay? So the farmer would lay this out into his plan. He would say, oh, the livestock are 6, 8 feet long at the most. I'll add a little space to walk behind them or wherever the aisle will be, and bam, that's going to be my first row of posts. That's going to be define my aisle. And so then the door would be usually about the same width. It's usually about 12 feet. And this is, the wider section would be for the hay, the loose hay. This was before hay lots. You had a hay mow or a hay mow, however you say it. So it was very much purposely done. Going forward, the Victorians didn't really like that look. They were all about symmetry. And they liked everything. So they would narrow the design or move the door so it would be centered. Yes?
A couple of questions. Were there barn rights, like house rights, or actually who built these buildings?
Yes, absolutely. You know, you talk about, and there's a romantic myth going around that, you know, the farmer built his barn. Well, no. If it was a good barn, it was done by an apprentice carpenter, or like you say, a barn right. A barn right is an actual term. The farmer helped, the neighborhood helped, but there was usually somebody enlisted who knew what they were doing, a trained apprentice person.
The other question is, a lot of the wood was farmed out on the coast, like shipbuilding, they brought the wood in from the south. Was that true of barns, or was that local wood used?
Mostly local. Yeah.
Your slide said there were 55,000 barns in 1890. Are there more or less now?
That was 1860.
Oh, okay.
People ask me that all the time. How many barns are in Maine? I have no idea. It used to be, and I got those numbers from the 1800s, it used to be you could look at a farm census and say, oh, bam, there's X amount of farms, there's probably X amount of farms. You can't do that today. A lot of people have farms and they're not farmers. So I think there are more today than there were then, just because the population grew. I know there are tens of thousands of them. I don't want to get more specific than that. Vermont did a barn census, which must have been a fantastic thing to do. I can't imagine doing that in Maine. Maine is bigger. But they did that in 97 or just before 2000, and they estimated they had 30,000 barns left. And they also estimated they were losing 1,000 a year to various things. So you do the math, does that mean there's 30 years of barn left in Vermont? You know? I think mostly just wealthy people or people that are still farming will end up keeping. Yeah.
I have a barn that has a much different structure than anything that I've seen in your book, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to explain it to you or not, because I don't know the terms of all the beams, but the beams that go from side to side, when they hit to the wall, they continue out another 20 inches.
Oh, yes. It's not the exterior. You're talking about like the main aisle area?
Yeah.
There's a horizontal beam.
Rafters come down and set on that. They don't touch the wall. They're above the wall. And they, when these cross pieces come out another 20 inches, there's a 6x6 that sets on the top of those and runs the length of the barn. The rafters come down and set on that.
You're talking about beams that go across the width of the barn?
Yes.
Okay. And they stick out from the posts?
Yes.
Do they go all the way to the end of the building? No.
Well, no, if you were looking at
It sounds
this-
like you're talking about a Dutch, or an anchor beam, is what it's called.
Okay.
Is it a massive beam? Is it oversized from the rest of the frame? No?
Eric Sloan's books have all kinds of those.
Yeah.
You're familiar with
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
Every
Eric,
kind
she's
of-
saying Eric Sloan's books. He does marvelous pencil sketches of various different
Yeah,
styles of
all
framing.
over, you know, the Dutch,
Yeah.
the French.
It sounds like you're talking about a Dutch thing, but, and then again, it sounds like maybe not. So. It's hard without visuals.
Well, I have a couple of pictures I'll show you afterwards.
Sure.
Do you think you talk about a flying plate so that it goes over the posts and out? Does it stick out in the eaves? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, that's not unusual.
It's not?
No. It's made with a connected girt style frame usually.
It doesn't look like, looking at it, it doesn't look like it would be very solid, because, you know, you'd think most rafters would come down and sit on the wall to be for support, but
Yeah. I think you're talking about this. This one right here. You say this sticks out. See, it goes past, and then there would be maybe another beam out here that's not in this picture, right?
right.
Would be tenon into this, would come out, and the rafters would go on.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that is called a flying plate, yep, thank you. That's not terribly unique.
Was there a time frame when that was used versus?
Usually the later half of the 1800s,
Okay.
usually. That's usually this style.
Are there brick barns in Maine?
Brick barns.
Massachusetts has.
I don't, there's one in the town I live in, Raymond. There's a few. I know there's a stone one on Mount Desert Island that gets photographed a lot. Not very common though, no. No. There used to be a few round barns, not very common.
I'm sure Don will be happy to stay longer and talk with any of you who'd like to talk with him. But those of you who have to leave should also feel free to do that. And as Don has said, he will be available to autograph and sell his books too. So we'll thank him now.
Okay.